Maybe we'll start with kind of a brief overview of the history, though, at least to the extent that we know much about it. You mentioned the British. This was a British colony. The British East India Company, I was reading, had a lot of, I guess, interest in the region.
They began annexing parts of what is now Burma in 1823, 24.
And so I guess there's a legacy of the English language there. Are there a fair amount of English speakers?
Yeah, at one point they had a legislative body that used English. And then there was, of course, a language movement to make Burmese the official language of the state, or at least a co-official language. But yeah, English is widely spoken, more so by folks who are older now. People who are in their 60s and 70s tend to speak better English than young folks. There was a real shift away from English language education under the military regime.
Interesting. So it sounds like this military regime was kind of playing up some Burmese nationalism.
Oh, very much so. They basically substituted nationalism for any kind of, they made the communists the enemy very early on, even though the current army that is the national army of the country was established by a Marxist-Leninist, the father of Aung San Suu Kyi, the current or the former leader now of the government. So her father went to Japan, and with what are called the 30 Comrades and with the Japanese, they formed an army to go and fight the British during World War II to get them out of the country and gain Burma's independence. And it turned out that the Japanese were even worse than the British, so they had to go and fight the Japanese. And then the British eventually, of course, acquiesced to demands for independence and did so in a way that, in their own words, according to a secret cable back to the Home Office, left Burma with, quote, a baby of complications that they had set up essentially during colonial rule through their divide and rule policy of governing the center, but also affording a great degree of autonomy and even promises of independence to many of the ethnic nationalities that were at the margins. So they made quite a mess, and then they washed their hands of it, and Burma's been in a state of perpetual civil war effectively ever since then.
You know, we could go on all day about the messes the British left around the world, and I mean, just the legacy of colonialism. I mean, it really seems like they were caught between the British and the Japanese, but also all these different ethnic groups and the tensions that arose from that within the region. But so this military government came to power, I was reading, in 1962. So specifically, what kind of initiated their coming to power?
Well, there was a democratically elected government at the time of independence, and it was, when it took power, 90% of the country was in the hands of various rebel groups. And over time, of course, the Burma state was able to consolidate its influence over increasing portions of the country, but it inherited quite a mess, and it fell into disarray, democratic government, corruption, and so on. And there was a sort of caretaker period where the military took over for, I believe it was a year or two, and then a restoration of democratic rule. And then in 62, finally, the coup that ended the whole democratic experiment, independence, and ruled. Well, still, I mean, they've never really ceded power since then. What they did with this current moment was set up a kind of diarchy or a system of parallel governance where the military remained above civilian oversight, control, above the law in many respects, according to the constitution that they wrote and that they imposed on the country in 2008 through an incredibly obviously rigged referendum where something like 96% of the people supposedly voted in favor of this army's constitution, despite the fact that the voting was happening right around when a massive cyclone that took 200,000 lives had just hit the country. So the Constitution is a complete fraud, and the military imposed it on the country. And that's what led to the current rigged system that is now sort of imploding.